How utterly déclassé. She actually did it. What a disgrace.
The piano keys felt like ice under Rachel's trembling fingers. Every note she struck landed wrong, a half beat late, a half step off, and she knew it, and she couldn't stop it. Her hands were shaking so hard the melody came out broken, stumbling, wounded. It was the exact, haunting lullaby from their shared past, the one melody Ji-Hoon forbade anyone from playing. Around her, souls elite sat in their silk and diamonds, exchanging glances, smirking behind champagne flutes. Someone laughed. Then Minna rose from her seat at the front table, her lips curled into something sharp and delighted. "Is this a joke?" Minna's voice cut through the ballroom, clear and merciless. "You call this music? You embarrass this entire estate." She sauntered over, casually tipping her glass so a splash of vintage champagne splattered right onto the pristine ivory keys near Rachel's hands before tossing a heavy gold coin at her feet. "This is what happens when you let the help play dress up." The room erupted in savage laughter. Rachel's fingers froze on the wet keys. She looked up and, desperate, tears burning her eyes as she searched for Ji-Hoon. He stood near the grand window, jaw tight, eyes cold as stone. He said nothing. He did nothing to stop the humiliation, but inside his tuxedo pockets, his hands clenched into fists, so violent that his knuckles turned white, his chest heaving as that broken melody ripped open his deepest, hidden trauma. He couldn't let his enemies see him weaken. "She's dismissed," Ji-Hoon said flatly, his voice cutting like a razor through the laughter as he refused to meet Rachel's shattered gaze. "Get her out." Minna smiled like she'd won a war, while Rachel gathered her dignity from the floor and walked out into the freezing soul night. The cold hit her before the shame did. Rachel stood on the marble steps of the estate, the heavy doors closing behind her with a sound like a verdict, and for a moment she just stood there in the freezing soul night, the gold coin still clutched in her fist from where she'd snatched it off the floor out of sheer spite. Her breath came out in ragged clouds. Her dress, the one Ji-Hoon's staff had picked for her, thin silk meant for warm ballrooms and not winter streets, did nothing against the wind cutting through the hills. She didn't cry. Not yet. She promised herself that much. The taxi ride back to the tiny apartment she still kept, the one she'd never given up, no matter how deep she'd sunk into Ji-Hoon's world, felt like it took a lifetime. When she finally sat on the edge of her bed, still in that ruined dress with the champagne stain drying stiff against the fabric, she let herself shake. Every insult replayed, every laugh, the coin thrown at her feet like she was a beggar in the street and not the woman who used to fall asleep on his shoulder while he told her, quietly, in the dark, that she was the only real thing in his life. That was a lie. She understood that now. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Amara, her oldest friend, the one person who told her from the beginning that Ji-Hoon's world would chew her up and spit her out in pieces. "Turn on your location. I'm coming. Don't argue with me tonight." Rachel didn't argue. 20 minutes later, Amara was sitting cross-legged on the bed beside her, arms wrapped around her, while Rachel finally broke, sobbing into her shoulder, the kind of crying that came from somewhere much older than tonight's humiliation. Amara didn't say much. She didn't need to. She just held on and let Rachel shake until there was nothing left to shake out. "You're done with him," Amara said eventually, not a question. Rachel pulled back, wiping her face hard with the back of her hand. "I'm done with all of it. The estate, the gowns, the recitals where I play Chopin for people who don't even like music. They just like watching me flinch when I miss a note." Her voice cracked, then hardened. "I'm done shrinking myself to fit in rooms that were never built for me." Amara studied her for a long moment, then reached over and picked up the small, battered notebook sitting on Rachel's desk, the one filled with scraps of melody Rachel had been scribbling in secret for years, things she never dared play in front of Ji-Hoon's polished, sneering circle. Half-finished jazz riffs, blues progressions bent sideways into something new, a gospel chord change stolen from her grandmother's church back home, twisted until it sounded like grief and joy fighting for the same breath. Then stop playing their music, Amara said simply, tossing the notebook onto Rachel's lap. Play yours. Something shifted behind Rachel's eyes. The weeks that followed were brutal and quiet in a different way. She cut every number tied to that world. She stopped checking the society pages that used to mention her as the boss's pianist, a title she now understood had always been a leash disguised as an honor. She sold the gowns. She let Amara drag her to a barber who cropped her hair close and sharp, a look that felt more like her than anything she'd worn in 5 years. She practiced for hours in the cramped apartment, hands blistering, ignoring the ache, chasing a sound that finally felt like it belonged to her, instead of a sound built to please a room full of people who'd never once clapped for her without being told to. Amara filmed her one night, almost as an afterthought. Rachel hunched over a battered upright piano in the corner of a half-empty bar Amara's cousin managed, playing a raw, aching, jazz-soaked reworking of that same haunting lullaby, the one from the gala, the one that had humiliated her, except now it didn't sound broken. It sounded like survival, like a woman clawing her way out of a grave she didn't dig. The video went up. Within 3 days, it had 2 million views. Within a week, it had crossed borders, subtitled in 6 languages, comment sections flooded with people saying they'd never heard grief sound like that before, like it had teeth, like it refused to apologize for existing. Rachel watched the numbers climb from her phone with something like disbelief written across her face. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It's real," Amara said, grinning so wide it looked like it hurt. "You're not the help anymore, Rachel. You're the headline." Meanwhile, across the city, in a boardroom lined with glass and cold steel, Ji-Hoon sat at the head of a table that no longer felt like it belonged to him. Min-ah sat 2 seats down, elegant as ever, her manicured fingers wrapped around a porcelain teacup, watching him with an expression he'd once mistaken for devotion. He didn't know yet, not fully, but something in his gut had started to itch the moment she'd smiled that night at the gala, the same razor smile she wore now. "The Busan shipment numbers don't add up," he said, sliding a folder across the table toward his chief financial officer, a man named Tae-sung, who Min-ah had personally recommended for the position 8 months ago. "Explain it to me." Tae-sung's eyes flicked, just once, toward Min-ah. It was barely a movement. Ji-Hoon almost missed it. Almost. "There was a clerical error," Tae-sung said smoothly. "We're correcting it." Ji-Hoon said nothing. He'd built an empire on knowing when men were lying to him, and every instinct honed over a decade of ruthless business, and rougher enemies told him Tae-sung was lying now. But there was something else underneath that instinct. Something newer, something that unsettled him more than the numbers did. A hollow, gnawing feeling that had been growing since that night at the gala, since he'd watched Rachel's hands shake on those keys playing a melody that belonged only to the two of them, a melody tied to a grave he never let anyone visit, and he'd done nothing. He'd stood there like stone and let Min-ah tear her apart in front of everyone, because that's what the version of himself sitting in this boardroom was built to do: feel nothing, show nothing, protect the empire at any cost, even the cost of the only person who'd ever made the empire feel unnecessary. He hadn't checked on Rachel once since that night. He told himself it was strategy, distance. That's what the boss does, the coldest voice in his head reminded him, the one that sounded like his father. You cut what threatens a throne. But some nights, alone in the enormous silent house that had never once felt like a home, he caught himself scrolling through old photos on a phone he thought he deleted them from, staring at a picture of Rachel laughing at something off camera, her head tipped back, sunlight in her hair, taken on one of the rare mornings they'd stolen away from the estate, away from Minna, away from every version of himself he despised. He'd delete the app. He'd reinstall it a week later. Minna's voice pulled him back to the present. You look distracted, Ji-Hoon, she said, her tone honey smooth, her eyes doing something calculating underneath the sweetness. Worried about a woman who plays piano badly? The table went silent. A few executives exchanged glances. Ji-Hoon's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath the surface. Watch your mouth, he said, low and even, the kind of quiet that made grown men in this industry go pale. Minna only smiled wider, sipping her tea, satisfied she'd found the crack. She didn't know yet how deep that crack ran. She didn't know that somewhere across the city, in a bar with peeling paint and a secondhand piano, the woman she'd humiliated was about to become untouchable, and the empire she spent years quietly hollowing out from the inside was about to collapse on the very man sitting across from her, wearing his father's cold eyes like armor that was already starting to crack. The video that started it all didn't stop climbing. Within a month, Rachel's name had become something people searched for on purpose instead of stumbling across by accident. Producers who once wouldn't have looked twice at a black pianist playing unrefined jazz fusion in some no-name soul bar were suddenly sliding into her inbox with offers, contracts, numbers with more zeros than she'd ever been offered in 5 years of playing dress-up for Ji-Hoon's circle. Amara handled the messages at first, because Rachel didn't trust herself not to say something reckless to men who'd have laughed her out of a room 6 months ago. But even Amara went quiet, staring at her phone one afternoon when an email came through from a national broadcast network, the biggest one in the country, asking if Rachel would headline a primetime special, not a guest slot, a headline. They want you, Amara said, turning the phone around so Rachel could read it herself. Not the boss's pianist, not the help, you. Rachel read it twice, 3 times, waiting for the catch, the fine print that would remind her this was still someone else's world and she was still just borrowing space in it. There wasn't one. She signed the contract 2 days later with hands that didn't shake. The lounge came next, an idea Rachel almost talked herself out of a dozen times before Amara refused to let her. A converted warehouse near the river, exposed brick, low gold lighting, a stage built low and close so the audience could see every twitch of feeling on the pianist's face instead of watching from some distant, sterile balcony the way Ji-Hoon's world always insisted on. She named it after her grandmother. She played the opening night herself, that same aching, imperfect lullaby reworked into something fuller now, richer, backed by a small ensemble she'd handpicked from musicians who understood what it meant to build something raw out of something broken. The room was packed, every seat, every inch of standing space along the walls. People who used to be invisible to rooms like Ji-Hoon's estate, artists, immigrants, kids who grew up being told their sound was too much or not enough, filled every corner of a space built entirely for them. When Rachel finished the final note, the silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before the room exploded into something louder than applause. It sounded like vindication. She didn't think about Ji-Hoon that night, not once. That more than anything felt like the real victory. Across the city, his world was coming apart at the seams he hadn't known were stitched by someone else's hand. It started small, the way these things always do. A supplier who suddenly couldn't be reached. A shipment rerouted without his signature on the paperwork, though the signature on file was unmistakably his, forged with a precision that told him whoever did it had studied his handwriting for years. Then the accounts. Ji-Hoon sat alone in his office at 2 a.m, the glow of his monitor the only light in the room, watching number after number drain from accounts he'd built from nothing, funneled through shell companies with names that meant nothing to him until he cross-referenced one against a real estate holding Min-ah had gifted to a cousin 18 months ago. His stomach turned to ice. He didn't confront her immediately. He watched instead. The same cold, patient discipline he'd used to survive a decade in this business turned now against the one person he'd let close enough to end him. He installed a camera in his own office, in the room where Min-ah met most often, with Tae-sung under the excuse of quarterly reviews. He told himself he was being paranoid. He hoped he was wrong. He wasn't. The footage was almost clinical in how little emotion it carried, which somehow made it worse. Min-ah, seated across from Tae-sung, laughing softly over a folder of falsified documents. "He still doesn't suspect anything," she said, voice light, almost bored. Ji-Hoon's too busy playing untouchable to notice he's already bleeding out. By the time the board moves to strip his shares, there won't be an empire left for him to inherit. Just a name and a mountain of debt with his signature all over it. Tae-sung had laughed, refilling her wine. "And the wedding? There won't be one," Min-ah said, smiling into her glass. "Why would I marry a man with nothing left to offer?" Ji-Hoon watched the footage 4 times. He didn't move. He didn't break anything, didn't shout, didn't do any of the things his father would have done in his position. He just sat there in the dark, something hollowing out in his chest that felt disturbingly close to the sound of that broken melody Rachel had played at the gala, the one he'd forbidden anyone from touching because it was the last thing he had left of his mother, the one piece of himself he'd never let this world corrode. He'd let them humiliate the one person who'd ever played it with the grief it deserved, and he'd let a woman who felt nothing near his hands. The coup, when it came fast. A board vote he wasn't warned about. Falsified records showing years of financial mismanagement. Every document stamped with a signature that was his but wasn't. Former allies who wouldn't return his calls, men who owed him favors going back a decade, suddenly developing selective memory the moment his name became a liability instead of an asset. Within 3 weeks, he'd gone from the most feared name in Seoul's underworld business circles to a man being quietly, efficiently erased from every deal, every account, every door he used to walk through without knocking. His own crew, the men who'd sworn loyalty in blood years ago, started disappearing too, peeling away one by one as word spread that the tide had turned, that Ji-Hoon Kang was no longer the storm, just a man standing in the wreckage of one. He tried to access his primary account the night everything finally collapsed and found it frozen. He tried to reach the one lawyer he trusted and got a voicemail box that was suddenly, permanently full. He stood outside the estate, his estate, the one his father built and he spent his whole life protecting, and watched security he no longer employed change the locks on the front gate without so much as looking him in the eye. He laughed. It was an ugly, hollow sound, nothing like the composed, controlled man who used to run rooms with a single flat sentence. He laughed because the alternative was breaking down right there on the street, and some broken, stubborn piece of pride wouldn't let him do that yet. Not with Min-ah's cousin's security guards watching from the gate like he was already a stranger, already nobody. He walked. He didn't know for how long or how far, just that the city felt different from this angle, colder, indifferent in a way it had never dared to be when he had power. Somewhere around midnight, Half frozen, stripped of the name that used to open every door in the city, he found himself standing outside a converted warehouse near the river, gold light spilling out onto the wet pavement, a small hand-painted sign above the door bearing a name he didn't recognize. But the sound drifting out through the open windows, he recognized that instantly. His whole body went still. That melody, broken open into something fuller now, but underneath it, unmistakably, the same aching, trembling heart of the lullaby his mother used to hum before he understood what loss was, the one he'd forbidden anyone from playing. Ji-Hoon stood frozen on the wet pavement outside the door, his breath fogging in the cold. His empire gone, his fiancée exposed as the architect of his ruin, and the only thing left pulling him forward was a sound he thought he'd buried the night he let Rachel walk out into the freezing dark alone. The door didn't feel like it belonged to him to open. That was the strangest part. A man who used to walk through steel gates and boardrooms like he owned the air in them stood frozen in front of a warehouse door with peeling gold paint, his hand hovering an inch from the handle, shaking and not from the cold anymore. He pushed it open anyway. The warmth hit him first. A wall of gold light and the low hum of conversation and glasses clinking, so different from the sterile chill of every room he used to command. Nobody looked at him twice when he stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the polished floor, his once immaculate coat plastered to his shoulders, his hair flattened against his forehead. He was nobody here. No security scrambling to attention, no whispered names traveling ahead of him through the crowd, just a soaked, pale stranger slipping quietly toward the back wall, half in shadow, trying to disappear into it. He needed to disappear. Everything in him that still remembered how to survive told him to turn around, that showing his face anywhere in the city right now was a liability, that Mina's people, or Tai-sung's hired men, could be watching every place with his name history attached to it. But his legs wouldn't listen. Not with that sound pulling him forward, the same aching melody drifting from the stage at the front of the room, fuller now, richer, wrapped in instruments he didn't recognize, but underneath all of it, unmistakably hers. And then he saw her. Rachel sat at the piano under warm gold light, spine straight, chin lifted, her hands moving across the keys with a steadiness that hit him harder than any blow he'd taken in this entire brutal month. There was no trembling left in her, no fear in the line of her shoulders. She commanded the room the way he used to command boardrooms, except nothing about it was cold. Every note carried something alive, something that made the entire crowd lean forward like they were being let in on a secret. She wasn't performing for anyone's approval anymore. She was simply, powerfully herself, and the room had no choice but to fall in love with her for it. He remembered her hands shaking on keys splashed with champagne. He remembered a gold coin thrown at her feet. He remembered his own voice saying she's dismissed like she was furniture to be removed from a room. And here she was now, radiant, untouchable, exactly the kind of unshakable he used to pretend to be. Ji-Hoon stood at the very back of the crowd, soaked through, shivering, his once tailored coat hanging off him like a stranger's clothes, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely and utterly small. The song shifted, deepened, and he recognized the exact moment it curved into the lullaby, the one that belonged to his mother, the one he guarded like a vault for 20 years because it was the only piece of her he had left that Mina's world hadn't managed to touch or corrupt or turn into currency. Rachel had taken his most private grief and turned it into something that filled an entire room without asking anyone's permission to exist. His chest caved in on itself. He didn't sob. He didn't make a sound at all. That was the worst part, the part that scared him, because a man who'd built his whole identity on control found that even now, gutted and frozen and utterly finished, some deep, stubborn instinct still refused to let him break out loud. So instead, the tears came silently, tracking down a face gone pale and hollow, dripping off his jaw and disappearing into the rainwater already soaking his collar, indistinguishable from the storm outside. His shoulders didn't shake, his breath didn't catch audibly. He simply stood there in the dark at the back of a room full of strangers and wept without a single sound, the most feared man in Seoul's underworld, dissolving quietly into nothing, while the woman he let the world destroy played on, radiant, oblivious to him, whole. A few people near him glanced over, caught the sight of a soaked stranger crying silently in the shadows, and looked away just as quickly, some instinct telling them this wasn't a moment to intrude on. He didn't know how long he stood there. Long enough that his legs went numb. Long enough that the song ended and the room erupted into applause that felt to him like it was happening somewhere very far away, underwater, muffled by everything collapsing inside his own skull. Rachel rose from the piano, bowed once, her smile easy and genuine, and it was that smile, more than anything, that finished him. He remembered a version of that smile aimed at him once, in private, in stolen mornings neither of them were supposed to have, before he chose an empire over her, before he stood frozen and silent, while Mina tore her apart in front of everyone he was trying to impress. She hadn't needed him to survive. She'd built something extraordinary out of the very wreckage he'd handed her. He turned to leave. Some remaining scrap of pride told him he had no right to be here, no right to intrude on something this hard-won with the mess of his own ruin. But his body, weak from cold and hunger, and 3 sleepless weeks of watching everything he owned get stripped away piece by piece, betrayed him. His knee buckled slightly against the wall he'd been leaning on, and the sound, small as it was, drew the attention of a woman standing near the edge of the stage. Amara. She'd been watching the back of the room out of old habit, the same protective instinct that had once made her check Rachel's location the night of the gala. Her eyes narrowed on the soaked, hollow-eyed man trying to fold himself into the shadows, and recognition hit her like a slap. Her jaw tightened. She didn't call out his name. She didn't need to. She simply turned, found Rachel already stepping down from the stage to greet a small crowd of well-wishers, and touched her arm, murmuring something low enough that no one else could hear. Rachel's smile faltered. She looked up, scanning the crowd, and for a moment her eyes swept right past him, catching instead on the door, on the wet footprints leading in from the rain. Then they found him, standing in the shadows at the back of her own lounge, drenched, pale, trembling, cheeks wet with tears he hadn't made a single sound over. The room around her seemed to go quiet in her own ears, though the actual conversation and clinking glasses carried on obliviously around them. Ji-Hoon Kang, the boss, the man who once stood at a window with his hands clenched in his pockets and said she's dismissed without so much as looking at her. He didn't look like a boss now. He looked like a man who'd been hollowed out and left standing upright out of sheer habit. Nothing left inside him but the echo of everything he used to be. Rachel's fingers curled slightly at her sides, an old, involuntary reflex from a body that remembered exactly what that man used to cost her. But she didn't look away, and for the first time since that night, in the freezing soul cold, she let herself really look at him. Not as the untouchable boss who let the world humiliate her, but as a man standing in the wreckage of everything he'd chosen over her, silently, devastatingly undone. The room hadn't fully registered what it was watching yet. Most of the crowd still caught up in their own conversations, but Amara had already moved to stand near Rachel's shoulder, arms crossed, eyes locked on Ji-Hoon, like she was daring him to take one wrong step. He didn't come closer right away. He seemed to understand, even now, stripped of everything, that he hadn't earned the right to close that distance on his own terms. So he stood there in the shadows, dripping, and said nothing, because for once in his life, he didn't have a single practice line ready. Rachel walked to him instead, slowly, every step deliberate, the way she used to wish she could walk through that gala instead of fleeing it. The room seemed to part slightly around her without her asking it to. Up close, he looked worse than she'd realized. The cold hollows under his eyes, the tremor in his hands he wasn't bothering to hide anymore, the coat that used to fit him like armor now hanging off his frame like something borrowed from a smaller, lesser man. This was not the boss. This was what was left when the throne got taken out from under him. "You have some nerve," Rachel said, quiet enough that it stayed between them, though her voice didn't shake at all. "Showing up here, tonight, of all nights." "I didn't plan this," Ji-Hoon said, his voice raw, stripped of every ounce of the flat, razor-edged authority it used to carry. "I didn't know this was yours until I heard it, until I heard that melody." "You mean the one you told me was ours," Rachel said, "before you stood there and let her throw a coin at my feet like I was a beggar in your house." He flinched like she'd struck him, which, in a way, she had. "I know," he said. "I know what I did. I've had 3 weeks to understand exactly what I did. Watching everything I built collapse the same way I let you collapse in that ballroom, and there isn't a version of that math that comes out in my favor." "No," Rachel agreed, "there isn't." Silence sat between them for a moment, thick with everything unsaid, while the crowd around them slowly began to notice, conversations dimming into a low, curious hush. "I'm not asking for the empire back," Ji-Hoon said, his voice cracking on the last word, despite every instinct screaming at him to hold it together. "I lost that because I built it on the wrong foundation, trusting the wrong people, believing loyalty could be bought with silence and control. I'm not even asking you to forgive what I did that night. I just needed you to know I heard it. I finally heard what that song actually cost you to play and what it should have cost me to just stand there and watch." Rachel studied him for a long moment, and something in her chest, some old bruised part of her that used to ache for exactly this kind of acknowledgement, recognized how much it had cost a man like him to say any of it out loud, in public, with nothing left to protect his pride. But she'd learned something in the months since that gala, something Amara had drilled into her on the worst nights when she wanted to fall back into old habits. Recognition wasn't the same as repair, and tears, even real ones, didn't rebuild what silence had broken. "You let them humiliate me," she said, "because you thought staying silent made you strong. It didn't. It just meant I found out on my own what strength actually looks like." She gestured briefly at the room around them, the packed lounge, the stage bearing her grandmother's name, the crowd that had chosen to be here for her and no one else. "This isn't me getting even, Ji-Hoon. I didn't build any of this to prove something to you. I built it because I finally stopped waiting for someone like you to decide I was worth defending." He nodded, slow, something in his face breaking open even further, quieter this time, no performance left in it at all. "I know," he said again. "I'm not asking you to let me back into that world. I don't think I even want that world anymore. I just didn't want to disappear without you knowing the truth finally caught up to me. That it cost me everything, and somehow losing everything still isn't what hurts the most." Rachel let the silence stretch, unhurried, aware that for the first time since she'd known him, he had nothing left to hide behind. No title, no estate, no cold practice control, just a man standing soaked and shaking in the room she'd built entirely without him. "There's a piano in the back," she said finally, nodding toward a small, quiet room behind the stage, away from the crowd's curious eyes. "It's out of tune. Nobody plays it because it's not good enough for the main room." A faint, dry edge crept into her voice. "Sounds about right for you tonight." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. Both of them understood that. But it was a door left open a crack, on her terms, in her space, with her rules, and Ji-Hoon understood better than anyone in that room what it meant that she was offering him anything at all. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," Rachel said, already turning back toward the stage where Amara stood watching, arms still crossed, though something in her expression had softened slightly. "Just don't make me regret it." She walked away without looking back, spine straight, chin lifted, radiant under the gold light of a room that belonged entirely to her, and behind her, for the first time in weeks, Ji-Hoon allowed himself to breathe.